They served me leftovers at Thanksgiving, not just any leftovers either. Cold mashed potatoes scraped from the bottom of the pot, turkey so dry it could have been cardboard, and cranberry sauce that still had the can ridges pressed into it. While my entire family sat around the mahogany dining table I bought them 3 years ago, laughing and passing around the good china I also paid for, I was handed a paper plate in the kitchen and told there wasn't enough room at the table. That was the moment I decided to tell them about the turkey farm I purchased last week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 31 years old. For the past decade, I've been the invisible foundation holding up my family's entire financial structure, though you'd never know it from how they treat me. I work as a senior agricultural investment analyst for Henderson & Associates, one of the largest agricultural investment firms on the East Coast. My salary is well into six figures, but more importantly, I understand land, livestock, and the intricate web of agricultural economics better than most people understand their morning coffee routine. The irony isn't lost on me that I've spent years analyzing farm acquisitions and agricultural investments for wealthy clients, while my own family treats me like I'm still the awkward teenager who couldn't get a date to prom. To them, I'm still Sarah who wore glasses too big for her face and spent Friday nights reading financial journals instead of going to parties. They see my success as some kind of fluke, a lucky break that happened to someone who doesn't deserve it. My family consists of my mother Linda, my older brother Marcus, my younger sister Jessica, and my sister-in-law Brittany. Marcus married Brittany 5 years ago in what can only be described as the wedding of the century, funded almost entirely by yours truly, though Marcus took all the credit for being such a good provider. Brittany came from money, or at least her family liked to pretend they did. She drove a leased BMW and carried designer handbags while working part-time at a boutique that probably paid her just enough to cover her daily Starbucks habit. Marcus works in sales for a mid-level tech company. He's good at his job, charming and personable in the way that gets people to sign contracts, but he's terrible with money. Always has been. In high school he spent his entire summer job earnings on a sound system for his car. In college I bailed him out of credit card debt twice. After graduation, when he couldn't make his car payments, guess who co-signed a new loan? When he wanted to propose to Brittany but couldn't afford the ring she expected, I quietly transferred $8,000 to his account with the understanding that it was a loan. That was 3 years ago. We've never discussed repayment. Jessica is 28 and considers herself an influencer, though her follower count hovers somewhere around 3,000 and most of her content involves her posing with products she can't actually afford. She calls herself a lifestyle consultant and charges people for advice on everything from home decorating to relationship management, despite the fact that she's never held a job for longer than 6 months and has never been in a relationship that lasted longer than a year. She lives in a studio apartment in the trendy part of downtown, pays twice what she should in rent, and supplements her irregular income by asking family members for money, which she frames as temporary loans for her business ventures. My mother Linda raised us as a single parent after our father left when I was 12. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and I have nothing but respect for the sacrifices she made during those years. But somewhere along the way, after I started making real money, she began to expect a certain lifestyle that she felt she was owed after all those years of struggle. The house I bought her 4 years ago sits in one of the better neighborhoods in town, complete with a 2-car garage, updated kitchen, and the kind of backyard that looks like it belongs in a magazine. She drives a car I lease for her, takes vacations I fund, and hosts dinner parties with ingredients I pay for. The dynamic established itself gradually, so slowly that I didn't notice until it was completely entrenched. It started with small things. Marcus needed help with a security deposit. Jessica's car needed repairs. Mom's health insurance didn't cover her prescription medications. I had the money, they had the need, and it seemed natural to help. But natural became expected, and expected became demanded, and somewhere along the way, I became less of a family member and more of a resource to be managed. The requests came disguised as conversations. Mom would call and talk about her day, casually mention that the property taxes were due, and she was a little short this month. Jessica would invite me to lunch, spend an hour talking about her latest business idea, then ask if I could spot her rent money just this once because a client payment was delayed. Marcus would show up at my apartment with takeout and beer, reminisce about old times, then work around to mentioning that he and Brittany were looking at a bigger place but needed help with the down payment. I said yes every time. Not because I was required to, but because I thought that's what families did for each other. I thought my generosity would be appreciated, that my success would make them proud, that my willingness to help would earn me a place at the table, literally and figuratively. I was wrong about all of it. The truth is, my family resented my success more than they appreciated my help. Marcus couldn't handle that his younger sister made more money than he did. Jessica felt threatened by my stability when her own life was a constant series of financial crises and failed ventures. Mom seemed to think that my success somehow diminished the struggles she'd endured raising us, as if my achievements were an indictment of her parenting rather than a result of it. And Brittany, who hadn't worked a full-time job since their wedding, treated me like I was Marcus's embarrassing relative who happened to be useful for paying bills. The breaking point had been building for months, maybe years, but I trace it back to last summer, when Marcus and Brittany bought their house. Not bought, exactly. Financed with my help. They wanted something in the suburbs, something with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool, something that would announce their success to the world. The mortgage payment was more than they could afford on Marcus's salary alone, but they assured me it was just temporary, just until Brittany finished her real estate certification and started making commissions. I co-signed the loan. More than that, I provided the down payment, $60,000 transferred from my investment account to theirs, with a handwritten agreement that they would pay me back over 5 years. The agreement is sitting in my desk drawer right now, signed by both of them, though they've never made a single payment. Not one. When they moved in, they threw a housewarming party. I bought the wine, expensive bottles that I thought would be appropriate for the occasion. I brought flowers, the kind of elaborate arrangement that you see in lobbies of upscale hotels. I even dressed up, wearing a designer dress that had cost me more than most people spend on groceries in a month. I wanted to celebrate their success, even though their success was only possible because of my money. The party was everything they'd hoped for. Their new neighbors came, co-workers, college friends, people from Brittany's yoga studio. The house looked perfect, like something from a home and garden magazine. Marcus gave a toast, thanking everyone for coming, talking about how grateful he and Brittany were to be starting this new chapter of their lives. He mentioned hard work, determination, following dreams. He never mentioned me. I stood in their kitchen, sipping wine that I'd paid for, listening to him take credit for achievements that were only possible because I'd quietly funded them. When someone asked how they'd managed to afford such a beautiful place so young, Brittany laughed and said they'd been really smart with their investments. Smart with their investments. I nearly choked on my drink. That night, driving home alone, while they continued celebrating with their friends, I started to see the pattern clearly for the first time. I wasn't a family member to them. I was a private bank that occasionally got invited to observe the results of my investments. My feelings didn't matter, my presence wasn't valued, and my contributions were either ignored or reframed as their own accomplishments. The realization should have made me angry, but instead it made me strategic. I stopped saying yes automatically. When Jessica called asking for rent money, I told her I was having my own cash flow issues. When Mom mentioned that her car needed new tires, I suggested she shop around for the best prices. When Marcus hinted that they were thinking about renovating their kitchen, I changed the subject. The response was immediate and telling. Jessica accused me of being selfish and forgetting where I came from. Mom wondered aloud if success was changing me, making me less caring about family. Marcus didn't say anything directly, but Brittany made pointed comments about how some people let money go to their heads. The message was clear. I was valuable as a resource, not as a person, and when I stopped functioning as a resource, I became a problem to be managed. Which brings me to this Thanksgiving, 3 months after I'd started setting boundaries, 2 weeks after I'd made the biggest acquisition of my professional career, and 5 days after I'd realized that my family had planned their entire holiday celebration without considering whether I was even invited. The call came from Jessica on Tuesday afternoon. Not an invitation exactly, more of an expectation disguised as a casual update. She was at Mom's house helping with preparations, and she mentioned almost as an afterthought that I should bring something for Thursday. Not a request for a specific dish, not a question about whether I was available, just an assumption that I would show up and contribute to their gathering. I asked what time dinner was served. She said 3 o'clock, but I should probably come earlier to help with the setup. I asked how many people were expected. She rattled off a list: Mom, Marcus, Brittany, herself, plus Brittany's parents and her brother Kyle, who was visiting from Portland. 8 people total. I asked if there would be enough seating. She laughed and said they'd figure it out. The casual tone of that conversation told me everything I needed to know about my place in their hierarchy. I wasn't a guest to be accommodated, I was staff to be utilized. Show up early, help with the setup, bring food, make sure everyone else had what they needed. The actual meal, the actual celebration, the actual family time, that was for other people. I could have confronted Jessica right then, could have demanded to know why I was being treated like hired help rather than family. But I'd learned something important over the past few months. Words didn't matter to these people. They could justify anything, rationalize any treatment, reframe any situation to make themselves the victims and me the problem. What mattered was actions, and I had been planning a very specific action for quite some time. 2 weeks earlier, I had closed on the purchase of Meadowbrook Farms, a 847-acre turkey operation, located 45 minutes outside of town. The farm had been struggling financially for 3 years, a victim of rising feed costs, increased competition from industrial operations, and an aging owner who no longer had the energy to modernize his business. When it came on the market, my firm had been hired to conduct the due diligence for a potential investor. I knew the property well, had walked every acre, reviewed every financial document, analyzed every aspect of the operation. The land was valuable, the location was ideal, and the existing infrastructure could be upgraded and expanded with the right investment. The asking price was reasonable, especially considering the long-term potential. What made it even more attractive was the timing. The seller needed to close quickly, before the holiday season, which meant he was willing to negotiate. I made an offer through a subsidiary company I'd established for personal investments. Not Henderson and Associates, not anything connected to my family or my public identity. Just a clean, straightforward acquisition that would give me complete control over one of the largest turkey suppliers in the region. The seller accepted, and we closed escrow on November 15th, 6 days before Thanksgiving. The beautiful irony was that Meadowbrook Farms had been supplying turkeys to the grocery stores where my family shopped for years. The 20-pound bird that would be sitting on their table Thursday afternoon, the one they would carve and serve and congratulate themselves for preparing, had very likely been raised on land I now owned. They would be eating my turkey, at a table I bought, in a house I financed, while treating me like I was lucky to get scraps. But they didn't know about the farm. They didn't know about a lot of things, actually. They didn't know that I'd been documenting every loan, every gift, every financial contribution I'd made to their lives over the past 5 years. They didn't know that I'd consulted with attorneys about the legal implications of family loans and financial gifts. They didn't know that I'd been quietly restructuring my own finances to disentangle myself from their dependencies. Most importantly, they didn't know that I'd been planning this moment for months, waiting for the right opportunity to show them exactly what they'd taken for granted. Thanksgiving seemed perfect, a holiday that was supposed to be about gratitude, about family, about recognizing what we have and who we share it with. A day when their hypocrisy would be on full display, when their lack of appreciation would be most obvious, when the contrast between their words and their actions would be impossible to ignore. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of November day that makes you grateful for warm houses and full tables. I woke up early, not because I needed to prepare anything elaborate, but because I wanted time to think through what I was about to do. I'd been planning this conversation for weeks, but the reality of it felt different now, that the moment was here. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that struck the right balance between respectful and powerful. A wool blazer that I'd bought for client presentations, dark jeans that were expensive enough to signal success without being flashy, boots that were both stylish and practical. I wanted to look like someone who belonged at their table, even if they'd made it clear that I didn't. The drive to Mom's house took 20 minutes through neighborhoods that got progressively nicer as you moved away from downtown. Her street was lined with mature oak trees and houses that had been built in the 60s, but updated with modern amenities. The house I'd bought her sat on a corner lot with a circular driveway and a front porch that she'd decorated with autumn wreaths and pumpkins. It looked like the kind of home where families gathered for holidays, where traditions were maintained, where everyone was welcome. I sat in my car for a moment before going inside, watching through the front windows as figures moved around in the warm light of the living room. I could see Marcus and Brittany on the couch, probably watching football. Mom was likely in the kitchen, putting finishing touches on dishes that would feed 8 people. Jessica was probably setting the table, arranging place cards and adjusting centerpieces. A normal family preparing for a normal holiday celebration. Except nothing about this was normal, and hadn't been for years. I wasn't arriving as a daughter and sister excited to spend time with people I loved. I was arriving as a creditor who'd been invited to watch other people enjoy the fruits of my investments. The turkey in the oven had been purchased with money I'd given Mom for groceries. The wine they would drink had been bought with my credit card during one of Jessica's shopping trips. The house itself, the plates, the furniture, even the clothes they were wearing, all of it connected back to my bank account in some way. As I walked up the front steps, I could hear laughter from inside, warm, genuine laughter, the kind that made you want to be part of whatever was happening. For just a moment, I felt a pang of something that might have been nostalgia, or sadness, or regret. These were people I'd grown up with, people who'd shared my childhood, people who were supposed to matter to me more than anyone else in the world. But then I remembered all the times I'd stood on the outside of their joy, all the celebrations where my contributions were acknowledged with a pat on the head, and a reminder not to expect too much attention. I remembered Marcus's housewarming party, Jessica's birthday dinner last year, where I paid for the restaurant but wasn't included in the group photo, Mom's retirement celebration where she thanked everyone except the person who'd made her retirement financially possible. I knocked on the door, a courtesy more than a necessity since I had a key. Brittany answered, wearing an apron over a dress that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Her smile was bright and automatic, the kind of expression she'd perfected for social media and client interactions. "Sarah, you're here." She stepped back to let me in, already looking past me toward the kitchen. "Mom's been cooking since dawn. Everything smells amazing." The house was warm and filled with the rich scents of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and cinnamon from whatever dessert Mom had prepared. It should have felt welcoming, should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt like walking into a performance, where I knew my role but hadn't agreed to play it. Marcus looked up from the couch as I entered the living room, raising his hand in a casual wave without taking his eyes off the television. "Hey sis, how's the turkey looking out there?" He was making a joke about the weather, about the gray sky and bare trees, but I heard something else in his tone. An assumption that I would laugh, that I would fall into our familiar patterns, that nothing significant had changed despite months of me pulling back from their constant requests for financial support. Mom appeared in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel that had been a Christmas gift from me 2 years ago. She looked tired but satisfied, the way she always did when she was hosting. "Sarah, honey, perfect timing. Can you help me get the turkey out of the oven? It's bigger than I expected." Of course it was bigger than expected. Everything was always bigger, more expensive, more complicated than planned when someone else was paying for it. But I followed her into the kitchen, playing my part for now, waiting for the right moment to change the script entirely. The kitchen was a disaster zone of preparation, every surface covered with bowls, serving platters, cooking utensils, and ingredients.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It looked like she was cooking for 20 people instead of 8, but that was Mom's style. She cooked with abundance, especially when she wasn't worried about the grocery budget. Jessica was at the stove stirring something that smelled like brown butter and herbs. She glanced over her shoulder as I entered, offering a smile that seemed more distracted than genuine. "Oh, good, reinforcements. Can you grab the carving knife from the block? It's the big one with the black handle." I found the knife, a professional-grade tool that I'd bought her last Christmas because she'd mentioned wanting to upgrade her kitchen equipment. As I handed it to her, I noticed that her fingers were stained purple from what looked like red wine. Day drinking wasn't unusual for Jessica, especially during holidays, but something about her slightly glazed expression suggested she'd started earlier than usual. The turkey, when Mom opened the oven door, was indeed magnificent. Golden brown, perfectly crisp skin, the kind of centerpiece that would look beautiful on social media and taste even better. It had been expensive, I knew. because I'd been subtly funding Mom's grocery shopping for months through a complicated arrangement where I paid her utility bills and she used the money she saved for food and entertainment. As we lifted the heavy bird from the roasting pan to the carving board, Mom chatted about her morning, about the timing of different dishes, about how nice it would be to have everyone together. She seemed genuinely happy, genuinely excited about the celebration, and for a moment I wondered if I was overreacting, if maybe this year would be different. Then Brittany's parents arrived. Carol and Dennis Walsh were exactly what you'd expect from people who raised someone like Brittany. Polished, proper, and utterly convinced of their own importance despite having achieved very little beyond maintaining appearances. Carol worked part-time for a nonprofit that organized charity events for wealthy donors, which she described as being a development executive. Dennis had sold insurance until his early retirement, which he framed as having been an entrepreneur in the financial services industry. They swept into the house with the kind of fanfare usually reserved for celebrities, carrying expensive wine and elaborate flower arrangements, air-kissing everyone and complimenting Mom on her beautiful home. Carol immediately began rearranging Mom's table setting, suggesting improvements to the centerpiece and questioning the wine selection. Dennis settled into the living room with Marcus and started holding court about stock market trends and investment strategies, speaking with the authority of someone who'd read a few articles in Forbes. I watched this performance from the kitchen doorway, marveling at how quickly the dynamic in the house had shifted. Suddenly Mom seemed anxious, eager to please, second-guessing herself about food that had smelled perfect moments before. Jessica became almost servile, refilling drinks and adjusting decorations according to Carol's suggestions. Marcus and Brittany transformed into the perfect young couple, successful and grateful and worthy of Carol and Dennis's approval. And I became invisible, not intentionally, probably. But as the Walshes took center stage, as conversations revolved around their travel plans and their opinions about everything from wine pairings to political developments, I found myself pushed further and further into the background. When Carol asked about the guest list, Mom introduced Marcus and Jessica as her children, mentioned me almost as an afterthought. When Dennis launched into a story about his latest golf tournament, Marcus hung on every word like he was receiving wisdom from an oracle, despite the fact that the story was boring and Dennis wasn't particularly good at golf. But the moment that crystallized everything, the moment that confirmed I was making the right decision, happened when we finally sat down to eat. Mom had set the table beautifully, using the good china and crystal that I'd given her over the years for birthdays and holidays. The centerpiece was elaborate, featuring autumn flowers and candles that cast warm light over the polished wood table. Place cards marked where everyone should sit, written in Mom's careful handwriting on cardstock that matched the fall theme. I looked for my place card and couldn't find it. Marcus was at one end of the table, Brittany beside him. Carol and Dennis sat across from them, positioned where they could easily dominate conversations. Mom was at the other end, closest to the kitchen so she could manage serving duties. Jessica had the remaining spot on the side, leaving her perfectly positioned to help Mom with dishes and refills. There was no place for me at the table. Oh, Mom said when she noticed me standing there, holding the bottle of wine I'd brought as a contribution. Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry, we're a little tight on space with Carol and Dennis joining us. Would you mind eating in the kitchen? I set up a nice spot for you at the counter. Would I mind eating in the kitchen? At the counter, like hired help, like someone who was lucky to be fed at all. I looked at the table that could have easily accommodated 9 people with a little creativity. I looked at the empty chairs in the living room that could have been brought over. I looked at my family, none of whom seemed to find anything strange about excluding me from the main celebration. That's fine, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'll just grab a plate. Mom looked relieved. There's plenty of everything. I made way too much food, as usual. I walked into the kitchen and saw the plate she'd prepared for me. Paper, not china. Portions that looked like they'd been scraped from the bottoms of serving dishes. Turkey that was more skin than meat. Stuffing that had gone cold. Cranberry sauce that was mostly liquid. The visual metaphor was so perfect it was almost funny. This was how they saw me, deserving of scraps. Grateful for leftovers. Someone who should be thankful for whatever attention they chose to give me. I stood at the kitchen counter, holding that paper plate, listening to the sounds of celebration from the dining room. Laughter, conversation, the clink of real glasses and real silverware. The warm, inclusive sounds of a family gathering that I was not invited to join. That's when I decided it was time to tell them about the turkey farm. I set the plate down without taking a bite and walked back into the dining room. They were in the middle of toasts, Dennis holding up his wine glass and saying something about gratitude and family and the importance of tradition. Perfect timing. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through his speech. "I have something I'd like to share." The table went quiet. All eyes turned to me, some confused, some annoyed at the interruption. Mom looked worried, probably afraid I was going to cause some kind of scene that would embarrass her in front of the Walshes. "I know this might seem like strange timing," I continued, "but I wanted you all to know about something that happened last week. Something I think you'll find interesting, especially given what we're celebrating today." Marcus frowned. "Sarah, can this wait? We were in the middle of—" "No," I said firmly. "It can't wait. You see, I've been thinking a lot lately about gratitude, about family, about what we owe each other, and what we can expect from each other. And I realized there's something you all should know." I paused, looking around the table at their faces. Confusion, irritation, curiosity, no warmth, no genuine interest in what I might have to say. Just impatience to get back to their celebration. "Last week, I bought a farm," I said simply. "A turkey farm, actually. Meadowbrook Farms, to be specific. Maybe you've heard of it." The silence that followed was complete. Even the background noise from the kitchen seemed to stop. Jessica was the first to speak. "You bought a what?" "A turkey farm," I repeated. 847 acres, full livestock operation, processing facilities, distribution network. One of the largest suppliers in the region, actually. Carol Walsh looked confused. "I don't understand, why would you buy a farm?" "Investment opportunity," I said, borrowing the casual tone they'd all used over the years when discussing my money as if it were a shared resource. "Good land, established business, strong cash flow potential. The kind of diversification that makes sense for someone with my portfolio." Dennis leaned forward, suddenly interested. "What kind of numbers are we talking about? Purchase price, annual revenue, projected returns?" Before I could answer, Mom interrupted. "Sarah, honey, this is all very nice, but can we discuss your business ventures later? The food is getting cold." "Actually," I said, still standing while they all sat around the table they hadn't made room for me at, "I think now is the perfect time to discuss it. You see, there's something poetic about the timing, something that I think speaks to the theme of today's celebration." I gestured toward the carved turkey that sat in the center of their table, perfectly golden and beautifully presented. "That bird you're eating, there's a very good chance it came from my farm. Meadowbrook supplies most of the major grocery stores in this area, so in a way you're all enjoying the fruits of my latest investment." The looks around the table were shifting now, moving from confusion to something that might have been unease. They were starting to sense that this wasn't just a random business update, that there was a point to this revelation that they weren't going to like. "Isn't that something?" I continued, my voice growing stronger as I found my rhythm. "Here you all are, celebrating family and gratitude and togetherness, eating a meal that I quite literally provided, sitting at a table I bought, in a house I purchased, using dishes I gave as gifts. And where am I sitting? In the kitchen, eating leftovers off a paper plate, because there wasn't room for me at the family table." "Sarah," Marcus started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished," I said. "See, buying that turkey farm taught me something important about supply chains, about where things really come from, and who's really responsible for making things happen. And I started thinking about the supply chain in this family, about where the money comes from, and who's really responsible for making all of this possible." I could see understanding dawning on some of their faces now, could see them beginning to realize where this was heading. So I thought this would be a good time to share some numbers with you. Some figures that might put today's celebration in perspective. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I'd been tracking everything for months. "I'm sharing some interesting statistics about gratitude and family contributions. For instance, did you know that over the past 3 years, I've transferred a total of $237,000 to various members of this family? The number hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Carol Walsh's fork clattered against her plate. Dennis stopped chewing entirely, his mouth slightly open in a way that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. Marcus, I continued, scrolling through my carefully documented records, your portion comes to $86,000. That includes the down payment on your house, the engagement ring, 3 car payments, credit card debt consolidation, and what you called emergency funds. But what I later discovered through social media were vacation expenses and that home theater system. My brother's face had gone completely pale. Brittany was staring at him like she'd never seen him before, which was interesting because I was fairly certain she'd been aware of at least some of the money transfers. Jessica, I said, turning to my sister who was now gripping her wine glass so tightly I was worried it might shatter, your total is $62,000. That covers rent payments, car repairs that turned out to be aesthetic upgrades, your photography equipment, that business course you never finished, and the rather expensive wardrobe you claimed was necessary for client meetings. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked like someone had just told her that her entire life was being broadcasted on national television. Mom, I said, my voice softer now because despite everything, she was still my mother, your total is $89,000. The house down payment, monthly utility contributions, car lease payments, property taxes, home improvements, medical bills, and what we classified as grocery and entertainment allowances. Mom's hand was pressed against her chest, like she was having trouble breathing. Sarah, I don't understand why you're doing this. Why now? Because I said, looking around the table at faces that ranged from shocked to mortified to angry. I realized today that none of you see me as family. You see me as a resource. A private bank that you can withdraw from whenever convenient, but never a person worthy of basic respect or consideration. Dennis Walsh cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with being witness to what he probably saw as a private family matter. Perhaps Brittany and I should give you some privacy to discuss this. Actually, I said, turning to him with a smile that felt sharp around the edges, I think you should stay, because this involves you too, in a way. You see, I've been listening to you hold court all afternoon, about investment strategies and financial planning, giving advice to Marcus about building wealth, and making smart decisions with money. Dennis preened slightly, clearly pleased that his expertise was being acknowledged. But here's what's interesting, I continued. Marcus can't make smart decisions with money, because he doesn't actually have any money to make decisions with. Every major purchase, every investment, every financial move he's made in the past 5 years, has been funded by me. So when you're complimenting him on his beautiful home, and his success, you're really complimenting my financial planning. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the living room ticking, could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Brittany was the first to find her voice. This is insane, Sarah. You're making it sound like we forced you to help us. You offered, you wanted to help. I laughed, and the sound was sharper than I intended. I wanted to help my family. I thought that's what families did for each other, but families also invite each other to dinner. Families save seats at the table. Families don't serve their sisters leftovers in the kitchen while strangers get the good china.
We're not strangers, Carol protested, looking offended. We're Brittany's parents. You're right, I said. You're not strangers. Strangers would at least pretend to care about my feelings. Strangers would ask about my life, my work, my interests. Strangers would say thank you when I gave them expensive gifts. You're not strangers. You're people who feel entitled to my generosity without offering anything in return. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. Sarah, you're being completely unfair. We never asked you to keep track of every dollar. We never asked you to hold it over our heads like this. You're right, I said. You never asked me to keep track because you assumed I never would. You assumed I would just keep giving and giving and giving and never expect anything back. Not money, not gratitude, not even basic respect. I put my phone away and walked closer to the table, looking at each of them in turn. Do any of you know what I do for work? Beyond the general idea that I work in finance. They looked at each other blankly. Jessica ventured. You analyze investments. I'm a senior agricultural investment analyst, I said. I specialize in farmland acquisition, livestock operations, and agricultural commodities trading. I've been doing this for 8 years, and I'm considered one of the top experts in my field on the East Coast. I've managed portfolio acquisitions worth over $50 million. I've been featured in industry publications. I spoke at a conference in Chicago last month about sustainable farming investments. More blank stares. None of this was news to them because they'd never bothered to ask about the details of my career. They knew I made good money, and that was all that mattered to them. Last year, I continued. I was offered a partnership track position with a firm in New York. It would have meant a 40% salary increase and equity participation in one of the most prestigious agricultural investment companies in the country. Mom looked slightly interested for the first time. You never mentioned that. I turned it down, I said. Do you know why? They waited for me to continue. Because it would have meant moving away from family. Because I thought my family valued having me close by. Because I thought the relationships I had here were more important than career advancement. The irony in my voice was unmistakable. Jessica actually winced. But today, I said, sitting in your kitchen eating leftovers while you all celebrated without me, I realized I made the wrong choice. I chose people who don't actually care about me. I chose convenience for people who see me as a convenience. Brittany looked like she was trying to formulate some kind of defense, but I wasn't finished. So let me tell you about Meadowbrook Farms, I said, settling into the tone I used for client presentations. 847 acres of prime agricultural land, annual production capacity of 50,000 turkeys, contracts with 3 major grocery chains and 2 restaurant suppliers. Previous year revenue of $1.2 million, with a net profit margin of 18%. Dennis was now paying attention with the focus of someone who actually understood what those numbers meant. Purchase price was $2.8 million. I continued. I paid cash, no financing, through a subsidiary company I established specifically for agricultural investments. Closing was last Tuesday, which means I've owned this operation for exactly 6 days. $2.8 million, Carol repeated faintly. You paid cash. I did, I said, from my personal investment portfolio, which apparently contains resources that my family has never bothered to learn about or ask about, despite the fact that they've been benefiting from it for years. Marcus was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language. I don't understand. If you have that kind of money, why are you making such a big deal about helping us? The question was so fundamentally tone-deaf that I actually laughed again. Because it was never about the money, Marcus. It was about respect. It was about being treated like a person instead of an ATM. It was about having my contributions acknowledged and my presence valued. I gestured toward the elaborate table setting, the beautiful meal, the warm lighting that made everything look like a magazine photograph. All of this is beautiful. All of this is exactly what a family Thanksgiving should look like. But there's no place for me at this table, literally or figuratively, and that tells me everything I need to know about where I stand with all of you. Mom was crying now, tears running down her cheeks in a way that might have moved me if I hadn't spent so many years watching her cry strategically whenever she wanted something. Sarah, honey, I'm sorry, we didn't realize. We can fix this. We can make room. It's too late for that, I said quietly. The damage isn't that there wasn't a chair for me today. The damage is that none of you thought I deserved one. The damage is years of taking my help for granted. Years of treating my success as your backup plan. Years of seeing me as useful rather than valuable. Jessica finally spoke up, her voice shaky with what sounded like a combination of anger and fear. So what are you saying? You're cutting us off. You're just going to pretend we don't exist. I'm saying, I replied, that our relationship is going to change, dramatically. I pulled out a folder I'd been carrying and set it on the table next to the carved turkey. These are loan agreements, proper legal documents with payment schedules, interest rates, and collateral requirements. If you want to continue receiving financial support from me, you'll sign these and start treating our arrangement like the business relationship it apparently has been all along. Marcus reached for the folder with shaking hands and opened it. His face went from pale to green as he read. This says I owe $86,000 at 7% interest with monthly payments of $1,800. That's correct, I said.
It's actually a very generous rate, well below what you'd get from a commercial lender, especially given your credit history. But I can't afford $1,800 a month, he protested. You know I can't afford that. Then I suppose you'll need to figure out how to increase your income or decrease your expenses, I said calmly. Maybe sell the house I helped you buy and move into something more affordable. Maybe Brittany could get a full-time job. Maybe you could pick up freelance work on weekends. You know, the kinds of things responsible adults do when they have financial obligations. Brittany was now frantically reading over Marcus's shoulder, her face getting redder by the minute. This is ridiculous. You can't just retroactively turn gifts into loans. Actually, I said, I can. I consulted with attorneys before drafting these agreements. Family gifts over a certain amount can be reclassified as loans if there's documentation of the recipient's acknowledgement and intent to repay, and I have plenty of documentation. I pulled out my phone again and showed them screenshots of text messages. Marcus saying he'd pay me back as soon as his next promotion came through. Jessica promising to repay rent money once her business took off. Mom assuring me that the house money was a loan, not a gift, and that she'd never forget my generosity. You kept screenshots of our private conversations? Jessica asked, sounding horrified. I documented our financial arrangements, I corrected. Which is what any reasonable lender would do. The fact that you consider them private conversations rather than business agreements just proves my point about how you've been treating this situation. Dennis Walsh had been quiet through most of this exchange, but now he spoke up with the tone of someone who was used to being listened to. Sarah, I understand you're upset, but this seems like a rather extreme reaction. Families help each other. That's what families do. I turned to him with a smile that was anything but warm. You're absolutely right, Dennis. Families do help each other. They support each other emotionally. They celebrate each other's successes. They show up for each other during important moments. They don't exile family members to the kitchen during holiday meals. That was just a seating issue, Carol protested. There wasn't enough room. There was plenty of room, I said. You could have used the card table from the basement. You could have borrowed chairs from the neighbors. You could have made it work if you'd wanted to. But you didn't want to, because accommodating me would have been inconvenient, and inconvenience is something you apparently expect me to absorb, but never to create. I looked around the table one more time, taking in their shocked faces, their half-eaten meals, the perfect holiday scene that had been shattered by the truth. This is what I learned from buying a turkey farm, I said. I learned about supply chains and dependencies, and what happens when the source of supply decides to change the terms of the arrangement. Mom wiped her eyes with the dish towel she was still holding. Sarah, please, don't do this. Don't destroy our family over money. I'm not destroying anything, I said. I'm just changing the terms of engagement. If you want to continue having a relationship with me, it's going to be based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. No more assumptions about my financial contributions. No more taking my presence for granted. No more treating me like I'm lucky to get scraps of your attention. I picked up the loan agreements and put them back in the folder. You have until December 1st to decide whether you want to sign these or find alternative arrangements for your financial needs. After that, the offer expires and you'll need to work with commercial lenders at commercial rates. Marcus looked like he might throw up. Sarah, you can't be serious about this. We're family, yes, I said. We are, and that's exactly why this is so disappointing. Family should be where you feel most valued, most appreciated, most loved. Instead, this is where I feel most used, most taken for granted, most invisible. That needs to change, or the relationships need to end. I walked toward the front door, leaving them sitting around their beautiful table with their expensive meal and their complete shock. As I reached for my coat, Mom called after me. Where are you going? You can't just leave like this. I turned back to look at her, this woman who had raised me and loved me, and also completely failed to see me as anything more than a resource to be managed. I'm going home to my own Thanksgiving dinner. I'm going to eat food I bought and prepared myself, at a table where I'm welcome, in a space where I belong. But you'll be alone, Jessica said, and for the first time all day, she sounded like she actually cared about my well-being. Yes, I said, I will be. And that's infinitely better than being surrounded by people who don't want me there. As I opened the front door, Dennis Walsh called out one last question. What about the farm? What are you going to do with a turkey operation? I paused in the doorway, looking back at all of them one final time. I'm going to run it, I said. I'm going to take an operation that was struggling under poor management and turn it into something profitable and sustainable. I'm going to prove that I know how to build something valuable, not just subsidize other people's poor decisions. But you don't know anything about farming, Brittany protested. I smiled, and this time it was genuine. I know about business. I know about supply chains. I know about customer relationships and profit margins and long-term planning. And unlike some people, I'm willing to learn what I don't know, instead of expecting someone else to handle the difficult parts. The drive home was quiet and dark, the November evening settling around me like a familiar coat. I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally set down a weight I'd been carrying for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. My apartment was small compared to the houses I'd helped my family buy, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every appliance, every decoration had been chosen by me, paid for by me, arranged according to my preferences. It was a space that reflected my taste, my values, my life, without any need to accommodate other people's expectations or demands. I changed out of my carefully chosen outfit and into comfortable clothes, then went into the kitchen to prepare my own Thanksgiving meal. Not a feast for 8, not an elaborate production designed to impress anyone. Just a simple dinner for one person who was finally ready to appreciate her own company. I had bought a small turkey breast earlier in the week, along with ingredients for basic sides. Nothing fancy, nothing that required hours of preparation or coordination with other people's schedules, just good food, carefully prepared, eaten in peace. As I cooked, I thought about the conversation that had just happened, about the shocked faces around that table, about the way my family had looked when confronted with the mathematical reality of our relationships. Part of me felt guilty for dropping such a bombshell during what was supposed to be a celebration. Part of me wondered if I could have handled it differently, more gently, with more consideration for their feelings. But then I remembered the paper plate in the kitchen, the leftovers scraped from the bottom of serving dishes, the way they had all looked past me and through me and around me, for hours without once asking how I was or what I needed or whether I was happy. And the guilt faded, replaced by something that felt like relief. My phone started ringing around 7 o'clock, first Marcus, then Jessica, then Mom. I let them all go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear their justifications, their promises to do better, their attempts to minimize what had happened or reframe it as a misunderstanding. I needed time to process what I'd done, to sit with the consequences of finally telling the truth. The voicemails, when I listened to them later, were exactly what I expected. Marcus was angry, accusing me of blindsiding them and using money as a weapon. Jessica was hurt, claiming that I had ruined Thanksgiving for everyone and that she couldn't believe I would embarrass the family in front of the Walshes. Mom was sad, saying she didn't understand where this was coming from and that she'd always been grateful for my help. None of them apologized for the seating arrangement. None of them acknowledged that maybe, possibly, they had treated me poorly. None of them seemed to understand that the money wasn't the real issue, that the loan agreements weren't really about getting paid back. They were about establishing boundaries, about forcing my family to see me as a person with rights and feelings rather than as a resource to be accessed at will. The turkey breast was perfect when I took it out of the oven, golden and juicy and exactly the right size for one person with reasonable portion control. The stuffing was simple but flavorful, made with ingredients I'd chosen specifically because I liked them, not because they were someone else's favorites. The cranberry sauce was homemade, tart and sweet in exactly the proportions I preferred. I set my small dining table with my own dishes, nothing fancy but clean and coordinated, and chosen with care. I lit a single candle, poured myself a glass of wine that I'd selected specifically for this meal, and sat down to eat in complete silence. It was the best Thanksgiving dinner I'd ever had, not because the food was better, though it was very good, not because the setting was more elegant, though it was comfortable and peaceful, but because for the first time in years, I was eating a meal where my presence was valued, where my preferences mattered, where I was welcome at my own table. As I ate, I thought about Meadowbrook Farms, about the 847 acres of land that belonged to me now, about the business I would be running starting Monday morning. It was a risk, certainly. I knew investments, but I'd never managed an actual farming operation. There would be challenges I hadn't anticipated, problems I'd need to solve, decisions I'd need to make without the safety net of an established corporate structure, but there would also be rewards. The satisfaction of building something with my own hands, of taking responsibility for success and failure without having to subsidize other people's poor choices. The opportunity to prove that I could create value, not just distribute it to people who took it for granted. My phone buzzed with a text message. I assumed it would be another attempt from my family to continue the conversation, but when I looked at the screen, it was from an unknown number. "Hi Sarah, this is Tom Bradley, the previous owner of Meadowbrook Farms. I heard through my attorney that you closed on the property this week. I wanted to reach out and offer my assistance during the transition. I know taking over a farming operation can be overwhelming, and I'd be happy to spend some time walking you through the daily operations, introducing you to the staff, sharing what I've learned over 30 years of running this business. No charge, just one farmer helping another. Give me a call if you're interested." I stared at the message for a long moment, surprised by the gesture. This was someone I'd met only briefly during the inspection and closing process, someone who had no obligation to help me succeed, someone who was probably relieved to be done with the stress and responsibility of running a struggling business. And yet he was offering his time and expertise freely, without being asked, without expecting anything in return. The contrast with my family's approach to relationships was striking. Tom Bradley, essentially a stranger, was offering genuine support because he thought I might need it. My own siblings and mother, people who had known me my entire life, couldn't be bothered to save me a seat at the dinner table. I texted back, "Tom, thank you so much for reaching out. I would very much appreciate your guidance. I'm planning to visit the property this weekend to get a better sense of the operation. Would Saturday morning work for you?" His response came within minutes. "Perfect. Meet me at the main barn at 8 a.m. Dress warm and wear boots. You don't mind getting dirty. Looking forward to working with you." Working with me, not taking from me, not expecting me to solve his problems, not treating me like a bank with legs. Working with me, as an equal, as a partner in a shared endeavor. I finished my dinner slowly, savoring each bite, enjoying the quiet of my apartment and the peace of not having to manage anyone else's needs or expectations. When I was done, I cleared my own dishes, stored the leftovers in containers that would provide several more meals, and settled into my favorite chair with a cup of coffee and the farm's financial records. There was work to do, budgets to review, staffing decisions to make, operational improvements to plan. It would be challenging, demanding, sometimes frustrating, but it would be mine. Every decision, every success, every failure would belong to me, not to people who saw my efforts as their entitlement. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard Jessica's voice. "Don't hang up," she said quickly. "I'm calling from Amy's phone because I figured you wouldn't answer if you saw my name." Amy was Jessica's college roommate, someone I'd met a few times over the years but didn't know well. I was irritated that Jessica had involved her in our family drama, but I was curious enough to listen. "What do you want, Jessica?" "I want to apologize," she said, and she sounded like she'd been crying. "I want to explain what happened today, why everything went so wrong." "I know what happened today," I said. "I was there. I was in the kitchen eating leftovers while you all celebrated without me." "That wasn't intentional," she protested. "Mom just got overwhelmed with the seating arrangements, and Carol was being so demanding about everything, and we didn't think you'd mind eating in the kitchen because you're always so accommodating about everything." Always so accommodating. As if my willingness to be flexible in the past justified treating me poorly in the present. "Jessica," I said, "the seating arrangement wasn't the problem. It was a symptom of the problem. The problem is that you all see me as someone who should be grateful for whatever attention you're willing to give me, rather than as someone who deserves to be included and valued." "That's not true," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "When was the last time you asked me about my life?" I asked. "Not my job, because you need money. Not my schedule because you need a favor.
When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing, or invited me to something because you wanted my company? There was a long pause. I don't know, she finally admitted. I do, I said. It's been over 3 years. The last time was when you were dating that guy Mike, and you wanted my opinion about whether he was trustworthy. And even then, the conversation ended with you asking if I could lend you money for a weekend trip. I didn't realize, she said quietly. That's the point, I said. You didn't realize, because you never think about what I might need or want, you only think about what you can get from me. So what happens now? She asked. Are you really going to make us sign those loan agreements? Are you really going to charge us interest on money you gave us as gifts? I'm going to treat our financial relationship the way any reasonable person would, I said. With clear terms, documented expectations, and mutual respect. If you can't handle that, then we don't have a financial relationship. And what about our regular relationship? What about being sisters? I looked out the window of my apartment at the city lights below, at the world full of people who manage to have relationships based on genuine care rather than financial dependency. That depends on you, I said. If you want to have a relationship with me that's not about money, then we can work on that. But it means actually seeing me as a person, not just as a resource. I do see you as a person, she protested. Do you know what my favorite color is? I asked. Another pause. Blue. It's green, dark green, like forest moss. You don't know because you've never asked. Do you know what kind of music I listen to? What I do on weekends when I'm not solving your problems? What my hopes are for the future beyond making enough money to keep funding your lifestyle? She was crying again. Sarah, I'm sorry. I know I've been selfish. I know I've taken advantage of your generosity, but I never meant to hurt you. Intent doesn't matter as much as impact, I said. And the impact of your behavior, all of your behavior, has been to make me feel like I don't matter except as a source of financial support. How do I fix this? She asked. How do we fix this? You start by signing the loan agreement and making your first payment, I said. You show me that you're serious about treating our financial arrangement as a real obligation, not just something you can ignore when it's convenient. And then what? Then we see if we can build a relationship that's based on something other than money. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But it has to start with respect, and respect means acknowledging the reality of what's happened between us. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, because the day had been painful, and the conversation with Jessica had been difficult. But peace, the kind that comes from finally telling the truth, from finally standing up for yourself, from finally refusing to accept treatment that you don't deserve. Tomorrow I would start learning how to run a turkey farm. I would make mistakes, encounter problems I hadn't anticipated, face challenges I wasn't prepared for. But I would do it as myself, not as someone else's safety net, not as a resource to be depleted, not as a person whose value was measured only by what she could provide to others. I was 31 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was going to find out who I was when I wasn't busy being who everyone else needed me to be. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that makes you grateful for warm coffee and thick jackets. I drove out to Meadowbrook Farms at 7:30, wanting to arrive early and spend some time walking the property alone before Tom Bradley showed up to begin my education in actual farming. The land looked different in the morning light, more expansive and somehow more real than it had during my previous visits for inspections and paperwork. 847 acres of rolling hills, pastures, and carefully maintained facilities stretched out in front of me, and the reality of what I'd committed to hit me with a mixture of excitement and terror. Tom's truck pulled up to the main barn exactly at 8, and I watched him climb out with the easy movement of someone who'd been working with his hands his entire life. He was probably 65, weathered and lean, wearing clothes that were clearly functional rather than fashionable. "Morning, Sarah," he called out as he approached, ready to learn how to be a turkey farmer. We spent the next 4 hours walking every inch of the operation. Tom showed me the breeding barns, explained the feeding schedules, introduced me to the 3 full-time employees who had agreed to stay on during the transition. He walked me through the processing facility, the cold storage units, the loading docks where trucks came to collect birds for delivery to grocery stores and restaurants. Most importantly, he shared the relationships that made the business work. The feed supplier who had been reliable for 15 years. The veterinarian who made monthly visits and emergency calls. The transportation company that handled deliveries. The grocery buyers who placed the largest orders and paid on time. Farming isn't just about raising animals, he told me as we stood in the main pasture, watching several hundred turkeys move across the grass in their peculiar, purposeful way. It's about managing relationships, your birds, your employees, your customers, your suppliers. They all depend on you, and you depend on all of them. By noon, my head was spinning with information about feed conversion ratios, processing schedules, seasonal variations in demand, and federal regulations governing poultry operations. But I also felt something I hadn't expected. I felt capable. Not immediately, not without a steep learning curve, but capable of mastering this challenge the same way I'd mastered agricultural investment analysis. There's something else you should know, Tom said, as we walked back toward the barn. Word travels fast in this business. People already know the farm has new ownership, and they're curious about who you are, and what you plan to do with the operation. What kind of curious? I asked. Mostly positive, he said. You've got a reputation in agricultural investment circles, and people respect that. But some folks are wondering whether someone with your background can handle the day-to-day reality of farming. It's different from analyzing investments on paper. I'm sure it is, I said. I'm sure I'll make mistakes. You will, he agreed cheerfully. Everyone does. The question is whether you'll learn from them and adapt, or whether you'll get frustrated and give up when things get difficult. As we shook hands goodbye, Tom handed me a business card that was worn around the edges and had his personal cell phone number written on the back in faded ink. Call me anytime, he said, day or night.
I mean that. The first year of farming is like the first year of parenthood. You never know when you're going to need advice urgently. I drove home thinking about relationships and dependencies, about the difference between being needed and being used. Tom needed me to succeed because he cared about the farm he'd built, and the people who worked there. My family needed me to succeed because they cared about the money I provided. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. Sunday passed quietly. I spent most of the day reviewing farm records and researching turkey farming techniques online. I also checked my phone periodically, noting that I had received no additional calls or messages from my family. The silence felt significant. Not peaceful, exactly, but purposeful. They were waiting to see if I would back down, if Thursday's confrontation had been just an emotional outburst that would fade once I'd had time to cool off. They were wrong. Monday morning, I drove to Meadowbrook Farms at 6 a.m. to begin my first day as a working farm owner. The employees, Maria, David, and Carlos, were already there, going about their morning routines with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from years of experience. They were polite but cautious, clearly wondering what changes I might implement and whether their jobs were secure under new management. I spent the morning working alongside them, learning their routines, asking questions, and trying to understand the rhythm of daily operations. By noon, my boots were caked with mud, my jacket smelled like turkey feathers, and I had a better appreciation for the physical demands of farming than any amount of financial analysis could have provided. Maria, who had worked at the farm for 12 years and clearly functioned as the unofficial supervisor, pulled me aside during lunch break. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you planning to make major changes? Lay people off, sell to developers?" I could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that her livelihood was about to disappear because someone with more money than farming experience had decided to treat the operation like a spreadsheet, rather than a living business. "I'm planning to make this farm more profitable and sustainable," I said. "But that means keeping good employees, not getting rid of them. I need people who know what they're doing to teach me what I don't know." Her posture relaxed slightly. "Tom said you were different from most investors. Said you actually cared about making the farm work rather than just extracting value from it." "Tom was right," I said. "This isn't just an investment for me, it's my business now, and I want it to succeed." That afternoon, I received my first call from a customer,
Janet Morrison from Morrison's Market, a small but upscale grocery chain that had been buying turkeys from Meadowbrook for 8 years. She'd heard about the ownership change and wanted to meet with me to discuss their relationship going forward. We met at her main store the next day, a beautifully designed space that catered to customers who cared about food quality and were willing to pay premium prices for it. Janet was probably 50, professionally dressed but with dirt under her fingernails that suggested she was involved in more than just the business side of grocery retail. Tom Bradley ran a good operation, she told me as we walked through her meat department. His birds were consistently high quality, his delivery schedule was reliable, and his prices were fair. My customers trust his product, which means I trusted his product. I plan to maintain that same standard, I assured her. I hope so, she said. But I've seen other farms change hands, and new owners often want to cut costs or increase volume in ways that compromise quality. If that happens, I'll have to find a different supplier. That won't happen, I said. I'd rather have a smaller operation that produces excellent birds than a larger operation that produces mediocre ones. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Tom said you were serious about learning the business. He also said you had resources to invest in improvements that he couldn't afford. Is that true? It is, I said. I'm planning to upgrade some of the processing equipment and expand the pasture area. Nothing that will compromise quality, everything designed to improve it. Good, she said. Because I've been wanting to market a premium line of pasture-raised turkeys for customers who are willing to pay extra for birds that are raised with higher welfare standards. If you're interested in that kind of partnership, we should talk. I left that meeting with a signed contract for an expanded order, and the beginning of what felt like a real business relationship. Not someone asking me for money, not someone taking my contributions for granted, but someone who wanted to work with me to create mutual success. Wednesday morning brought my first crisis. David called me at 5 a.m. to report that several birds in the north barn were showing signs of respiratory illness. I drove to the farm immediately, called the veterinarian, and spent the day learning about poultry disease management while watching Dr. Peterson examine sick turkeys and prescribe treatment protocols. This kind of thing happens, he told me as we discussed quarantine procedures and medication schedules. The key is catching it early and responding appropriately. Tom always did a good job with prevention and quick response. I hope you'll maintain that approach. I will, I said. What do I need to learn to handle situations like this better? He spent the next hour explaining warning signs, prevention strategies, and emergency procedures. Like Tom, like Janet Morrison, like everyone I'd met in the farming community, he seemed genuinely interested in helping me succeed rather than just extracting value from our relationship. That evening, as I sat in my apartment reviewing medication schedules and quarantine protocols, my phone rang. Mom's number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Hello, Sarah, it's me. I've been thinking about what happened on Thursday, about everything you said. I think we need to talk. We can talk, I said. But first, have you reviewed the loan agreement I left with you? There was a pause. That's what I wanted to discuss. The terms you're proposing are quite harsh. The terms I'm proposing are standard for personal loans between family members. I corrected. They're actually generous compared to commercial rates. But $89,000, she said. I never thought of the money you gave me as a loan. I thought it was just you helping your family. It was me helping my family, I said. But help doesn't mean giving up my right to be treated with respect. And respect means acknowledging that my generosity has limits and my contributions have value. I understand that you're upset about the seating situation, she said. But destroying the family over one mistake seems extreme. One mistake, as if years of taking me for granted, years of treating me like a resource rather than a person, years of celebrating my contributions while ignoring my presence, could be dismissed as one mistake. Mom, I said, this isn't about one seating arrangement. This is about a pattern of behavior that tells me you value my money more than you value. That's not true, she protested. You're my daughter. I love you. Then sign the loan agreement and start making payments, I said. Show me that you're serious about treating our financial relationship as a real obligation, not just something you can take for granted. I can't afford the monthly payments you're asking for, she said. You know I can't. Then we need to discuss alternatives, I said. Maybe you sell the house I bought you and move into something more affordable. Maybe you get a part-time job to supplement your income. Maybe you ask Marcus and Jessica to help with the payments since they've also benefited from my generosity. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how likely those options were. Sarah, she said, finally, I don't understand what's happened to you. You used to be so generous, so willing to help. Now you're acting like a stranger. I'm acting like someone who has learned the difference between helping and enabling, I said. I'm acting like someone who refuses to fund other people's lifestyles while being excluded from their lives. You're not excluded, she said. You're always welcome. Welcome to help, I said. Welcome to pay for things. Welcome to solve problems. But not welcome to be treated as an equal. Not welcome to have my preferences considered. Not welcome to expect basic courtesy and respect. I hung up before she could respond, and turned off my phone before she could call back. Thursday marked exactly 1 week since the Thanksgiving confrontation that had changed everything. I spent the day at the farm, working with Maria to develop a new feeding schedule for the birds recovering from the respiratory illness, meeting with a contractor about upgrading the processing facility, and reviewing financial projections for the next quarter. At lunch, David approached me with something that might have been a smile. You know, he said, when we first heard the farm was being sold, we were worried about getting some city investor who didn't know anything about farming and didn't care about anything except profit. And now, I asked. Now I think maybe we got lucky, he said. You ask good questions, you listen to the answers, and you're not afraid to get your hands dirty. Tom picked a good successor. That afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a check for $1,800 and a note written in Marcus's handwriting. First payment on the loan agreement. I need more time to review the terms, but I want you to know I'm taking this seriously. I stared at the check for a long time, surprised by the gesture and unsure how to interpret it. Was this genuine acknowledgement of our changed relationship, or just a strategic move to buy time and sympathy? I decided it didn't matter. Actions would speak louder than motivations, and this was the right action regardless of what prompted it. That evening, I called Tom Bradley to update him on the week's events and ask his advice about the equipment upgrade I was planning. We talked for over an hour, and as we wrapped up the conversation, he said something that stayed with me. You know, Sarah, I've been farming for 40 years, and I've seen a lot of people try to make it in this business. Most of them fail, not because they don't work hard, but because they don't understand that farming is about relationships. You seem to understand that instinctively. What do you mean? I asked. You care about the people who work for you, the customers you serve, the animals you raise. That's what good farming is about. Building relationships that create value for everyone involved, not just extracting value for yourself. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment thinking about relationships and value creation, about the difference between my family's approach to our connections and the approach I was learning in the farming community. My family saw relationships as opportunities for extraction, chances to get what they needed from people who had resources. The farming community saw relationships as opportunities for mutual support, chances to create success that benefited everyone involved. 2 weeks later, I received loan agreements signed by all 3 family members, along with first payments from Jessica and Mom. The amounts were smaller than what we'd originally discussed, but they represented payment plans we'd negotiated that were realistic given their actual income levels. More importantly, I received a call from Jessica asking if I wanted to have lunch the following weekend. Not because she needed money, not because she had a crisis that required my help, but because she wanted to spend time with me and learn about the farming business I'd started. I've been thinking about what you said, she told me, when we met at a small cafe near my apartment. About how I never ask about your life, never show interest in what you're doing. I want to change that. Okay, I said. What do you want to know? She asked about the farm, about the learning curve I was navigating, about the challenges and rewards of running a business, so different from my previous career. She listened to my answers with what seemed like genuine interest, asked follow-up questions, shared observations about my experience that suggested she was actually paying attention. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my sister rather than to someone who was evaluating me as a potential resource. "There's something else," she said, as we finished our coffee. "I want to get a real job. Not freelance consulting, not influencer marketing, not another attempt to monetize my hobbies. A real job with a steady salary and health benefits, and normal working hours." "That sounds like a good plan," I said. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I've been avoiding traditional employment for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to function in a normal workplace. But I can't keep living like this, always on the edge of financial crisis, always depending on other people to solve my problems." 6 months later, Meadowbrook Farms was profitable for the first time in 3 years. We'd expanded our pasture-raised turkey program, established relationships with 2 new restaurant clients, and implemented operational improvements that had increased our profit margins without compromising animal welfare or product quality. More importantly, I had learned that I was capable of building something valuable from the ground up, capable of earning respect through competence, rather than just providing it through financial contribution. My family relationships had evolved too. Marcus and Brittany were making their loan payments consistently, and had started including me in social gatherings as a guest, rather than as staff. Mom had gotten a part-time job at a local library, and was taking pride in reducing her dependence on my financial support. Jessica had been promoted twice at her new job, and was building a life based on her own achievements rather than my subsidies. Most surprisingly, we had begun to enjoy each other's company. Without the underlying tension of unacknowledged financial dependency, without the resentment that came from one-sided giving, we were discovering what we actually had in common and what we genuinely valued about each other. That Thanksgiving, exactly 1 year after the confrontation that had changed everything, I hosted dinner at my apartment. Not because I felt obligated, not because anyone expected me to provide and organize and manage, but because I wanted to celebrate with people who valued my presence as much as my contributions. The menu was simple, the table setting was modest, and the guest list was small, but everyone who sat at my table was there because they wanted to be, and everyone who wanted to be there had a place at my table. For the first time in my adult life, I was grateful not just for what I had, but for who I had chosen to become when I finally learned the difference between being generous and being used. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.